Welcome to the Dylan Experience. Today is episode 73, and I've got a special guest for you today. But before we get to that guest, make sure you like, subscribe, follow the channel, and make sure you stay in touch with us. My guest today is the Director of Curriculum at Precision Nutrition. She is a prior researcher and faculty member of York University in Toronto, and a well-rounded author of several books, including Why Me Want Eat and The Essentials of Nutrition Coaching for Health, Fitness, and Sport textbook, and many other academic publications, articles, and reports. My guest has over 20 years in the fitness and health coaching arena and 10 years dedicated to university teaching and course direction. She has lectured internationally all over North America, to the UK, Ireland, China, Australia, and Southeast Asia. So I'm happy to present Dr. Krista Scott-Dixon. Krista, how are you?
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. That was a great introduction. I should also say that in the time of writing that bio and arriving here on this podcast, I've actually changed jobs, which is
Really?
very exciting for me because I was actually at Precision Nutrition for 14 years.
Wow.
And it was really something that was like embedded in my identity. And so I've just gotten a completely new role. And we can talk about what that is, because I think there's relevance for things around mental health and health overall.
Sure.
But yeah. So currently my role is to I'm the director of product at a digital health app. And the vision is to say, like, can we make health accessible through digital tools to everyone all
Yeah.
over the world? So yeah, just want to throw that in.
How interesting. And I don't want people to get the wrong idea. Like this, although this podcast is mental health focused, that's not everything that I go over here. I think mental health in general is such a broad spectrum topic that reaches so many different aspects of life that it almost requires us to have multiple conversations about so many different topics, right? Like just yesterday, not obviously when this is going to air, but yesterday I was recording episode 72 where we were talking about sex trafficking. And a couple weeks ago we were talking about cerebral palsy. I've talked about so many different topics on this podcast, and I think what is always consistent and remains current is this ability to have conversations with respect and regard for people's experience. I mean, it's quite simple. If you want to have good conversations, you have to respect where the person's coming from, even if you don't like them. And certainly that's not the case here, right? Like
Not yet.
not yet, right? We'll find a way to hate each other at the end, right? With the judicious cussing that we're going to be doing here. I love the ability for people to come on this podcast and challenge me, and for me to challenge them, and to understand more about how we can approach all sorts of different subjects and recognize where I don't know what I don't know, and where you may not know what you don't know, and to just move the ball forward. And I think academically that was always the goal, but I think at times that gets muddied. I think the water gets muddied in a lot of different places, but I'm excited. Congratulations on the new job, and certainly especially how important just what you just said, that position and that goal is so necessary more than ever, right? To give people access to something that should be in many ways well known to them, of how do you maintain your own health. That you feel like that should be something that would be a fundamental focus for educators at any age.
Well, and to go back to what you just said, I think sometimes there's an idea that mental health is something that is divorced from the rest of anything, and it's only something that happens inside your own brain,
right,
completely contained by you as an individual, rather than something which is completely integrated with all of the other things that we experience, right? And so one of the things that we know is a major mental health challenge is simply not being able to access any health services, whatever type that is. And one of the things we're finding, especially in places like the US and places where kind of there's not a strong public healthcare system, is that people are turning to these other modalities as their frontline healthcare provisions. So now it's like, I'm not going to go to the doctor. I'm going to ask an app. I'm going to ask Reddit. I'm going to ask Google, right? And there's downsides to that, but I think it really signifies people do want to know about their health and they're struggling with very particular health things, but they don't always feel like completely resourced in,
Yeah.
being able to get the answers, being able to get the support.
Well, I'm a good example of that, right? I'm not a certified therapist, counselor, mental health professional. I'm not. I've never been any kind of license, and I don't attempt to be. That doesn't mean I haven't done my research and I haven't done the work to understand what I'm talking about. And yet people find me, right? And they enjoy working with me because it's something that actually works for them. Not to say I'm perfect, because I'm not. I'm not going to be able to solve everybody's problems, nor do I think I can. But what I tend to focus on is helping people solve their own problems. And I think that's really what we're kind of digging into, is that there's a necessity for people to want to be a part of their own solution, and not just like this abstract idea. Like, there's a tangible requirement in the whole process of healthcare that you want to be healed. You want to be, you want to solve your own issue. And I think, books like When the Body Says No, The Body Keeps the Score. I mean, these really profound pieces of modern literature that are saying there's a massive connection between how you actually approach stress, how you approach your mental health and well-being, that it affects how your healing is actually conducted. And I I can't even express how important it is to recognize that the mind and the body are not two separate things, but they're one very, very interconnected structure and system, that you can't just dismiss the idea that, oh, because I go to a therapist, that's going to solve all my mental health problems. It's far more intricate and important to dig into everything. And I'm sure, like, without digging too much into what you do, myself, I'll let you kind of explain that. You've probably done so much more research into that realm than I have. I'll let you explain that.
All right, well, let's get into the illusion of body mind duality and sort it out in a few minutes. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is so important, and I mean, there's so many threads that we could pull out, but I think we're sort of gesturing towards this idea that health is a deeply multifaceted thing, and it's not just an individual thing. We heal in community, we heal in connection. And you were talking about being a coach, and obviously anyone who's listening who's a coach knows that even if you're an amazing coach, you can't help everybody, right? There are going to be those clients that you can't help, or you help them imperfectly, or you're just like, 1%, you help them get 1% better or whatever. And that's just how it works. But we do know that the two great predictors of people's mental health improving when they're working with a coach or therapist or counselor is, number one, the quality of the helping relationship, the warmth, the authenticity, the supportiveness, the security, the safety. And number two is the person being helped, their belief that this is possible. So even if they feel like, okay, this is probably going to take years, it's going to be hard, it's going to suck, I don't know what I'm doing. But we do know one of the greatest predictors of whatever we could call success, and listeners can't see I'm putting this like in finger quotes, right? But whatever we could call success, is the core belief that that I can be helped.
Right.
And so I find that kind of empowering, but I want to be careful when I mention it, because I don't want to make it sound like, oh, mental health is just kind of a belief problem, right? If you believe that you're going to get better, then you will, right? Because we know that, again, healing requires community. I can't just heal myself, even if I go and I talk to a really great practitioner.
Right.
Other things have to be happening in my life, in my environment, in my contexts, situational factors, in my other connections, that enable me to heal. And so if I see you for an hour a week, or even 3 hours a week, even if I come see you every single day, that's
Yeah.
still only 7 hours a week. And I
Yeah.
have 161 other hours in my week to contend with, right? So, I think we really need to take a very expansive view on what health is and involves and requires. And one of a great saying that one of my coworkers used to say is, the best athletes have the most coaches. And I love that saying, right? Because what it means is that in order for you not even to excel, but just to kind of flourish at a very high level, you need all the help you can get. And so I think this is an important message to convey, because I think people think about mental health like, oh, if I have to go see someone, it means that I'm somehow deficient. Like I couldn't have figured this out on my own.
Right.
But fundamentally, I sort of think of a coach as like a full-length mirror. You know, maybe you have stuff stuck to your butt and you can't see it, right? Like you fundamentally, there's just stuff you cannot see, even if you're well-intentioned, even if you're educated. And I mean, you mentioned some of these books like The Body Keeps the Score and When the Body Says No. And, a lot of these practitioners will say in their sessions, because I've done courses with them, you cannot regulate, but I mean, especially if you're younger, but you cannot regulate in isolation. Like it's just
Yep.
impossible. So you can have moments where you're by yourself and you're handling your situation, right? But at a deeper level, if you hope to heal and grow and flourish, you require relationships. You require contextual support.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this earlier. Like we thrive when we have the ability to communicate with people, not necessarily to, I think expression is so important, but it's not just expression, it's the reception of that expression. It's,
That's right.
like this, I think this podcast is a great example of it, because every week I have someone new to talk to, and I challenge people, but every week it seems like they come back to me like after the podcast is over and look at me and say, Dylan, that was, the most respectful way I've ever been challenged before. And I've learned something from that. Because I just question things, but I try to look at the person across from me and respect who they are. And because you have something to say, and whether it's right or wrong is not the important part. It's the ability to express that and then allow it to be received, where you recognize that I actually care, right? And that's the safety I think you were talking about before, and that garnishes belief. I think that it emphasizes belief, because then you see that I care, and it's like I believe that together we can find what is right or wrong here. And whether that's me or you, it doesn't matter. What matters is more the expression and the reception, the connection that's actually made, more than right or wrong. Like we've looked at history and seen that there are so many things that we were doing wrong, right? 500 years ago, we thought the world was flat, and people now still feel like it's flat, but that's another discussion. But we can have conversations with them. Whether they think they're right or wrong doesn't matter. We need to learn how to connect with them. And I think culturally, because I think that's a huge conversation in terms of mental health, we are about to, I think, explode those conversations. I think we're deconstructing things right now. I think we're deconstructing religion, and the problems with religion right now. I think we've obviously started to deconstruct racism. Oh my gosh, I can't even talk about sexism right now, because that is, we thought we were deconstructing it, but now we're really deconstructing it. And all of these things that we are opening ourselves up to, I'm really curious what the next 10 years are going to look like, because all of these conversations are happening at such scale that, I think so many mental health problems are being kind of emphasized right now, and people are feeling that. But I think that's a good thing for the future, because what we're seeing is that we're deconstructing all of the problems that have created those issues. And now people are more willing to actually express themselves and have it be received. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think sometimes people look at that and say, this is a huge epidemic or a pandemic, and if you will. And I'm so remarkably curious as what the next 10 years is going to look like.
Yeah, I was thinking with that too. So I'm on board with you fully. And it makes me think of the great feminist legend Gloria Steinem, who said way back in the 60s, we didn't have terms like sexual harassment back in the day. Back then we just called
Yeah.
it life, right? And
Yeah.
so it would be tempting to think, oh my God, has everything gotten just terrible now?
Yeah.
But what's happening is that we're having conversations about this kind of stuff, whatever this kind of stuff is.
Yeah.
The conversations are more public. There's a lot of things coming out into the open and being spoken about that never would have been discussed even 20 years ago. And we
Yeah.
know that Gen Z, or that's Gen Z for you people in the US who say your letter's funny. We know that Gen Z is, of any other generation that we know of. I mean, humanity is kind of, we tend to think of stuff being new, although when we look back into history, we're like, oh yeah, actually they were doing this stuff a long time ago. But
Yeah.
I think Gen Z is the first generation in a really long time to have a very expansive global view of things and to be very interested in things like social progress and asking really difficult questions. And I think for them it feels like a very pressing and urgent issue because they are feeling things like, oh my God, I'm inheriting a planet that could be on fire in the
Yeah.
next 30 years, right? God knows what pox is coming down the pike right now.
Right.
So I think to them, a lot of these issues feel very pressing to explore and discuss in a way that maybe they didn't for previous generations. Or, I mean, certainly there have been lots of other difficult and painful times in history, but the language wasn't necessarily there, or the cultural paradigm, or even the ability. Right now, I was saying, I work for a global health app.
Yeah.
I'm talking, my colleagues are mostly Europeans, right? So now I can access audiences and conversations and people literally all over the world. Now, that's one thing that's never been possible in human history before. Yes, of course,
Right.
we traveled, but it would take, like 3 years to get
Yeah.
across one of the oceans,
Yeah.
right? So I feel like the conversations are emerging fast and furious, and we know that Gen Z is much more exploratory, much more expansive, much richer, much more interested in diversity. Like we know, for example, that quite a significant proportion of youth who identify as queer also identify as gender fluid or non-binary. Like gender is getting exploded, and racialization is getting exploded, and class is getting exploded. So I have a lot of both hope for the next 10 years and also a little bit of dread, but that's really mostly just to sort of say like what kind of zombie apocalypse is going to be next week's event. I think that's just being alive in 2022, though, that general feeling of
Right.
like paranoid dread.
Well, things are happening, right? Like, at the time of us recording this is in August. Obviously the Russian-Ukraine conflict has been flowing for quite some time now. Taiwan is an interesting one, and we'll see what happens by the time this podcast actually releases in January. I wouldn't be surprised if something happened in Taiwan with China, but there's certainly a lot of dread, and I would say, including in kind of going back to what you were saying, is like generation wise, millennials grew up in very much intrinsically with social media. That was the first generation to really, I think, interplay with social media, right? I remember MySpace and AOL, and right, like all of these. For the first time, you were having conversations that you didn't have to really work really hard to get and make happen. And you were seeing people and you were recognizing people online. And I think that turned conversations back on the generation before them, right? The Gen X, the baby boomers. And now Gen Z is really looking at that and saying, you guys fucked up, right? Because you're seeing, I can't tell you how many millennials I've talked to and worked with who are like, yeah, I just can't be around my parents. So we've excommunicated them, right? We don't talk to our parents. We don't talk to that side of the family, right? That happened to me. Like I don't talk to my dad's side of the family after he ended his life. Like that's pretty common, but it wasn't all that common, before I think internet, maybe. I don't know. I'm just guessing because culture has transformed itself, and now it's curious to see. Certainly that's not the only thing that's lending itself to Gen Z looking back and saying, yeah, we've got a lot of questions here, right? We've got a lot of concerns here, and how do we actually interact here? It's really interesting to kind of see that. And what I would say is that those generations, right? What I would say is like everything Gen X before and millennials kind of, I think, where the demarcation line kind of happens, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like after millennials, everything really focused on the micro interaction. Everything before millennials, it really focused on cultural interaction, right? Of maintaining the cultural status quo and maintaining this is how we do business. This is what's normal, and you can't change that. Not to say that people didn't think for themselves back then, but that's what it feels like from my perspective as a millennial, kind of looking back and seeing that's how people interact with perspective. Whereas now perspective is very much fluid. It's a very fluid kind of conceptualization for younger people where they're like, yeah, I don't really care, right? Like I don't really have a worry. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily the best thing, nor would I go back and say that what, people before us was doing or were doing was the best thing. But there certainly has to be a middle ground. We have to kind of connect that, the understanding of what is important within tradition. Why are certain traditions important? Why are certain status quo situations important? And why is it important to also be free flowing and free thinking? And I think right now we're kind of converging on that conversation right now. I just don't know if anybody's really diving in to, be the first one to expose it and blast it out there and hold a position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as you're talking, I'm mentally contrasting the different generational perspectives in my own family. And I was telling you before we got on, this is going to be episode 73, and I was born in 1973, which makes me almost 49 in a few weeks. And my parents are boomers, and they were raised by, my grandmother's still alive. She's 90, she's almost 96. And, so we like to hate on boomers a lot of time because it's like,
Yeah.
they do this, they thought this, they're a pain in the ass, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that they were raised by people who went through the Depression, who went through massive social migration and depression and economic uncertainty,
Who were
with
called the golden generation.
yeah, and like the amount of deeply ingrained social problems that
Right.
existed. I mean, we did not invent social problems,
Right.
definitely. It's just that people didn't talk about them.
Yep.
They repressed them, they assertively repressed them. They drank them away. They smoked them away. They died young. Like my father's, so my father would have been in his late 70s, but all of his relatives just died of smoking and drinking in their 40s. Like that's how they rolled
Yep.
in that generation. And so, I think on the one hand, we can look at various generations and say, well, this is how they're screwing it up, like you said, but also have compassion for that. And so, for example, like one of the things I think is the hallmarks of Gen X, which I've only begun recently to reflect on, is the large scale societal emotional neglect that we experience. So,
Right.
obviously there's shitty parents out there, and some of us were like really neglected. I was not. I had good, white, middle class, suburbanite parents, like, and not to associate goodness with whiteness, just to be clear if anyone's
Right.
listening, but like, it was ticked the boxes of social privilege. I guess maybe that's the way, my parents were highly educated. We lacked for nothing material. So I enjoyed an incredible amount of social privilege on a lot of different axes growing up. The one thing we didn't have, though, was emotional engagement from our parents. So we had
Right.
food to eat, we had clothes, even if there were sometimes hand-me-downs, right? But we had just large-scale emotional neglect. And so by 8 or 9 years old, we were latchkey kids. Like no one gave a crap about our feelings. Like we were not, no one was interested. It was like, no one said, hey guys, what do you want to do on holiday? It was like, get in the car, may or may not wear seatbelts, right?
Right.
We're going somewhere. Like no one was interested in what you thought, what you felt, what your psychic development was, or anything like that. And so I think sometimes Gen Xers are like, well, all these goddamn kids with their, mental illnesses, like we just sucked it up. Yeah. And what did that cost us, right? Like,
Right.
so most of us were the recipients of some kind of benign emotional neglect that taught us you don't really matter that much. Your needs don't really matter that much. Suck it up and be a cactus.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting now. A lot of boomer parents are like, well, how come you don't call? How come you don't come see us? It's like,
Right.
because you provided our material needs, but you didn't give a crap
Right.
what we were feeling and thinking and doing. So I think it's really easy to kind of foment intergenerational resentment. At the same time, I think, if we look across the generations, again, there's got to be a lot of compassion there, and to look contextually at,
Right.
well, if my parents were raised by depression survivors, like what, I'm sure they were. I mean, my father had stories back in the day. First of all, he would say like, "Oh, my mom never hugged me," but it was fine. I was just like, "Dad, that's not fine."
Fine.
Or like to him, it was like funny, right? Like, oh, his alcoholic dad put him through the wall one time, but it was my dad's fault because he was playing his drums when dad was sleeping, and it was kind of funny at the time, and dad got really mad when like all this kind of stuff. And then so my dad had the story of like, oh yeah, when I was 4 years old, walking by myself down the road in farmland, I got hit by a car and dragged, and eventually someone came and found me. Like, oh my God, right?
Wow.
So no wonder they have no emotional skills. Like that's what they grew up with.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I want to kind of go back to like that generational, looking back, and I had to look it up because I wanted to make sure, but they were called the greatest generation, 1901 to 1927, and then the silent generation, 1928 to 1945, obviously. And to be raised, I think, by the silent generation of which baby boomers came out of, we're talking about one of the most traumatic times in human history, right? Not just the Great Depression, but World War II, right? World War II, me and my son were literally just talking about this, killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. That is a incredible amount of people for 6 years. And to think about it, obviously my work is mostly within the realm of trauma, right? I deal with so many people that have gone through trauma, and so I study it pretty intimately. When you are raised, when you have trauma, you don't have a healthy form of communication. It's almost impossible because you can't recognize there's this disconnect between identity and who you want to be, because who you had to be does not match up with who you want to be, because who you had to be had to survive. You had to do things to survive. And so this generational perspective that forced themselves to survive in ways that were fundamentally unhealthy and in many ways disgusting and terrifying and fear-ridden, then taught an entire generation to do very similar things, right? And that has just kind of continued on. And we see, I imagine you would see the generational impacts of that trauma all the way into the 90s, potentially. And I know I did. I know like how my grandparents were and my dad was. Certainly you see the indirect impacts of what that generation cost us. And not to say it was a bad generation. I mean, these people fought and died for something that was of the utmost importance and absolutely necessary to stop and stem the tide of evil. But we can look at the consequences of that and be like, that sucks. That really, really sucks. And the recognition is important, and right. And approaching it with compassion is so profoundly important. We need to kind of look at that trauma as a generation, as each generation does, and have a conversation about it. Because I know, like when I when I've had conversations with my family, sometimes I can't even have conversations with the people that are in my generation about trauma, let alone people before me. And I think it's a good thing where we are at, where we can actually start having these conversations. This last Christmas, my whole family kind of had a whole conversation about trauma. And for the first time, I think I've ever heard my mom and my uncle and my aunt actually start having conversations about their parents, and what it was like for them. It's the first time I've ever heard any kind of conversation about that between the three of them. And that's different, right? Like that's when I can kind of recognize, like, wow, my family's changing. Even though it was 1996 when my dad committed suicide. So obviously there's a big trauma there, but since then we've never had conversations about trauma. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it took what, 25 years plus to start having familial conversations about this. So it's a challenge. It's a remarkably difficult challenge, but it's one that I think will emphasize to, you know, Generation Z, millennials, even, the importance to look back and see what baby boomers, the silent generation, Gen X, all have to teach us, because
Mm-hmm.
there's a very much a disconnect where we don't want to look back and say what you have is valuable. We want to look back because of trauma and say what you gave us was terrible and you should be ashamed of yourself. And that's not a good conversation to have. It's not a good way to
Mm-hmm.
start a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it's a very constricting, shutting down kind of conversation. And, as you're talking, I'm almost imagining these kind of concentric circles.
Yeah.
And so at the center of the circle, obviously, is every individual, right? Within, so we experience trauma within our individual body, right? The
Yeah.
cells almost literally are inscribed with traumatic things that we've experienced or even that our parents experienced. So we know that traumatic events, affect genetic expression several generations down the line. And then, maybe one circle out from us is our immediate family or our family of, that we were raised in, whatever family that is. And then, as the circles go outwards, we have generations, but we also have kind of like culturally specific experiences. And so,
Right.
I live in British Columbia, in Vancouver, Canada, for those of you listening. And, there's been a lot of conversations, well, across Canada too, but I think BC was one of the epicenters of leading the conversation, where there have been discovery of remains of, children at Indigenous residential schools. And, how deeply, deeply traumatic that's been for communities here generationally. And so it's not just the events that happened, but also the impact that it had on entire populations of people, stories, heritage, language, identities, that were in some ways wiped out, in some ways forever transformed. And so, the circles of trauma kind of radiate outwards, and they look different ways for different groups of people, but the layers of trauma, I guess what I'm getting at, are very complex. But to your point, there's also opportunities there, because what gets us out of trauma, or not that we ever necessarily fully escape it, but what starts the healing is connection.
Yep.
Right. So I cannot heal from generational or collective trauma on my own. I have to be having conversations, with other people in my concentric circles.
Yep.
And so again, we keep circling back around to we heal in community. So
Yeah. Yeah. It's remarkable. I imagine we can have this conversation for a couple hours, but I feel like I haven't given you time to explain who you are and where you've come from. And I think I'd kind of love to hear that now. I kind of have done it backwards. We've had a whole discussion and a debate in some way. But we haven't, I don't know your story, and I'd love to know your story, because it's really remarkable to have a conversation with you. So why don't you take a minute, or 10 or 20, I don't care how long you go, but tell me how you ended up here, and why. Like, why have you done all of the things that you've done, and why have you obviously ended up here in this podcast talking about all the things that we're talking about right now?
Yeah. So then I could stop being some random stranger talking about trauma. Yeah, I mean, And it's funny to talk about backgrounds because there's the superficial layer of things, right? And then there's the deeper layer of things like how does anyone arrive anywhere? But I guess, a quick overview about me is that I came from a social justice background. My family was actually always interested in social justice. And I mean, speaking of generational trauma, my grandfather was he was from the Ukraine originally. Talk about, trauma of migration. Had he arrived in Canada a few years earlier, he would have found himself in an internment camp. But anyway, he arrived at the right time, and he was a labor organizer up in Northern Ontario, and he was investigated for being a communist. And so he was under surveillance for many years during the 50s and early 60s for being a communist. So anyway, but so I come from a family who, that has a lot of interest in social justice and social progress. And so I kind of brought that into my graduate studies, which was in women's studies and gender studies, and just a kind of a range of topics there. A lot of I got very interested in work and employment because I think that's, and paid and unpaid work. So all of the ways that we can work. And for me, that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, because, as we've seen in conversations around capitalism that have occurred during the pandemic, work is something that really shapes almost all of our lives in some way. And economics is really where we see power being deployed in society. So finished my PhD in 2002. Thought I wanted to be an academic. So I was, doing the academic grind for 5 years. And then I was just like, this sucks.
Yeah.
And I had to leave. I was just watching the university become so much more corporate and bureaucratic and becoming just a machine more than anything else. And I
Yeah.
wanted to do things that helped people, right? Especially with a background in social justice. Like I can't feel good about myself if I'm locked away literally in a basement windowless room on campus, writing articles that nobody reads and that do nothing to help real people. And so after 5 years, I was like, okay, I got to get out of here. This is so dysfunctional. And I had this kind of side interest in health and fitness. I kind of got myself into shape because, I had to do something to heal my grad student body. And so I've been working as a personal trainer on the side, which FYI pays way better than grad student employment.
Sure
But
does.
and so I sat down and I calculated how much could I make as a personal trainer, self-employed, versus the work that I'm doing now. I was like, oh my God, like I'd be doubling my wage if I consider it on an hourly basis. So anyway, so I did the personal training thing for a while, but then I had colleagues at Precision Nutrition, and I was like, hey, listen, I'm unemployed. They're like, well, cool, come work for us. And so I had this background in teaching and research, curriculum development, coaching, health and fitness. And so that kind of became my role at Precision Nutrition for 14, almost 15 years. And so, I was writing their textbook and creating their coaching programs, all that kind of stuff. And, then we kind of arrived at the end of that journey and here we are. But along the way, it became deeply evident to me that, in the course of coaching and teaching and I probably coached and taught thousands of people at this point. It became really evident that, so much of what we talk about in health and fitness and nutrition is just superficial, right? What workout should you do? Are carrots good or not? Like carbs, should you eat carbs? Should you drink water? How much? Like these are just superficial bullshit questions most of the time.
Yeah.
And really what people are seeking in a health journey is some kind of deeper fulfillment by and large. Now, they don't know that at first. Like they're not signing up to go to the gym going, oh, I really want to fill my soul. It's not like that. They think they want abs, right?
Yeah.
But it very quickly becomes completely apparent that only a very, very tiny percentage of people have what I would call a logistical problem with health, which is that I don't know what to do. I might need help with some daily life routines. And once I get those sorted out, then I'm good.
Yeah.
Geez, I felt bad. I drank some water. I feel better. Okay, great. Right. And that's great when you have those problems that they're easily solved. But most people, that's not what they really, really need. They're asking, implicitly deeper questions like, am I okay? Am I lovable? How do I heal the pain that I'm feeling? How do I get out of the discomfort that I'm experiencing? How do I manage the emotions that I'm either experiencing in a way that I don't enjoy or that I'm completely dissociated from, but are still driving my behavior?
Right.
So I got much more interested in these deeper questions. And so I went and, did a counseling certificate. I got very interested in trauma. My current kind of side hobby that I'm really interested in is psychedelic assisted therapy, which I think is a super fascinating area of inquiry. Being the other thing about being a Gen X is that some of us were like old potheads and ravers back in the day. So we did our share of psychedelics back. And it's funny because like now, people doing psilocybin trips are like, okay, well, like they're dosing really precisely. And I'm like, man, in 1991, we just like grabbed a handful of mushrooms and ate it. Like I can't even imagine how much psilocybin we consumed at any one time. But anyway, so that's that's really my current interest. Aside from kind of my day job, which we've already kind of briefly described. But yeah, I mean, I think to go back to your earlier point about how we conceptualize mental health now, I think that we have so many more diagnostic tools and possibilities and deeper understandings of how the body works and how the brain works and the fascinating potential for future research down the road. Like we now understand these things at a physiological level in a way that previous generations did not. And so if I say like trauma is written on your body, that's not metaphor, right? Like I can show you the mechanistic basis, or loneliness, right? Yeah. We can look inside you and see metabolites that signal, kind of broad-based social stress. So for me, what's really exciting is that we're now coming to a new understanding, and potentially a much more enlightened understanding about things like addiction, depression, a whole variety of emotional, mental, physical health challenges, and the interconnectedness of that, that allows us to think about it in new ways. So I mean, that's kind of been my trajectory, and maybe implicit in that is the idea that I'm interested in a lot of different things. Yeah. Picking a lane is not my jam. I want to be in all the lanes all the time, learning everything about everything. But I think the beauty of that is it allows me to make connections that, wouldn't necessarily exist. And so, working with nutrition clients, health fitness clients, I'm interested in asking questions about them that I think go beyond just the usual, like, drink water and eat vegetables. Not that that's like, really, if we all just drank water and ate vegetables and got some sleep, like that would probably solve quite a lot of problems that people do have.
Right. It's not a bad thing. It's just not the thing that's probably going to make people focus on their health.
It's not enough.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I totally relate when you say, I want to be in all the lanes all the times, because I started this and I was like really focused on suicide because that's my experience. Like I lost my dad to suicide at 6 and I almost committed suicide at 25. So that was really where my story centralized. But I found myself, because I've been in the military for 15 years, I found myself wanting, in 2020, when I started all this, I was like, I'm going to talk to veterans. I'm going to talk to male veterans because that's who I know, guys who are thinking about suicide, guys who are, grade A alpha males, want to, kick down doors, kill people, do the job, right? Because I come from the infantry. That's part of my nature, right? Of how I was built. So I was like, I know those guys. And I started talking on on Instagram and TikTok about suicide and feelings and emotions and trauma, because I had learned all of this in the 7 years or 5 years after I had almost ended my life. I did just a ton of research, right? And women found me, right? Hundreds of thousands and millions of women found me, and I was like, what the fuck is happening here, right? Like what I'm like, I'm here to talk to veterans. Why are traumatized women coming and finding me? And I was like, at first I was like I was put off by it. I was like, this is weird. I don't even know what to do here. I feel like I'm building a fan base of people that I don't even know, right? But then I started talking to them. I started like having conversations and listening to the issues, and I was like, man, like the conceptualization that PTSD is that the military has a monopoly on it is ridiculous. And it's so social, it's so culture, it's so mainstream that like we don't, like, trauma is not a military only event, and what people don't realize or didn't realize when I first started talking was it's not a one size fits all thing. right? Like if you were in the military, it's the only kind of person that has trauma. It's everybody. And I don't think there's really been a lot of people that go out on social media or, you know, in the media in general and just say, you've all been through trauma, right? Like we've all been through trauma. I hate the idea that we look at trauma and we say how many people have had PTSD, and it's about 8 million people a year have PTSD. And it's like, why don't we talk about how common trauma is, right? If you've cut your finger, you've had trauma. If you've been yelled at, if you've been slapped by a parent, if you've been punched, kicked, you know, if you've been attacked by a dog, like the unending ways that you can be traumatized are profound. And when we don't recognize that, if we don't recognize that, we're just going to continue to create silent and isolated people. But when we can have conversations of how did I traumatize you, then we can start getting to the bottom of, or even the opposite. How was I traumatized? Well, now we can start having conversations. Now we can start recognizing how to express feelings and needs, and exposing people, right, and doing their own exposure therapy to themselves and say, you know what, I've always been afraid to talk to men because I was sexually assaulted at 9 years old. But now I have women that have been sexually assaulted and they come to me and have conversations because it's the first time they've ever actually had the opportunity to have a conversation with a man that isn't trying to use them for some sort of sexual exploit or some form of kind of sexualized conversation of sort or relationship or whatever, where it's the first time they've actually been shown empathy or compassion from a man. And that's just an example, but there's also men that also can't have relationships with women because they were sexualized by them. And so the awareness that I learned from social media of all places, to understand just how far reaching trauma is, I think was the most profound thing that I've ever learned of recognizing, like, I knew I had been through trauma, but I didn't recognize all the trauma. I was like, when I got home from Afghanistan, I was like, yeah, that was pretty traumatic, right? Because they started talking to me about PTSD, and I was like, I'm hearing all the symptoms, and I'm like, wow, that sounds a lot like, you know, my childhood. I was like, for the first time at 23 years old, after going through a deployment where I saw guys die, I saw guys, you know, lose body parts, I saw so many injuries. That was the time where I started to recognize, like, wow, like I had actually been through trauma before this. I had seen trauma before this, like, because I have all these feelings, and I started. That was the first time I started looking back. First time, 23 years old, right? A 23-year-old man, right? It's not. I don't think that's an uncommon story, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't doubt that I was a toxic individual before that, not recognizing just my own capacity for harming other people. I knew I had anger issues. I had isolation issues. And to recognize that only at 23, well, that's 23 years where I could have, I don't even know who I had harmed. And I feel terrible about that. But at the same time, here I am. I've made changes. I've made so many leaps and bounds to understand who I am, my capacity as a man for not only violence, but for domination, control, all of those things. Because if you don't think you can be dominating or violent or aggressive as a man, I think you're a fucking moron. And you really need to pay attention to yourself, because even now, even in my state of remarkable self-awareness, I recognize that I get angry, and I recognize that I have to, because if I allow my anger to then expand to a point where it's uncontrollable, if I don't approach stress and say to my wife, like, hey, I'm stressed, I have a problem, right? That's going to blow up someday. And that's going to be a problem. It's going to be a worse problem than it was before, because now I have 2 kids, right? And I don't want to leave lasting impacts on that. And so, all of these things that you're talking about, I'm going to go back to what I was originally talking about. It's been long-winded, but there are so many different directions that I want to go because I need to understand more about how to approach my own interaction, not just in trauma, but in all places. And to help people also recognize that gives me an understanding of how to communicate that.
The more we do this as a collective project, the more we have language to communicate it. Because one of the things that creates trauma, as I'm sure you know, and your listeners know, is not necessarily what happens to us, but the fact that it was too much too soon and we were alone when it happened. There was we might have had people around us or with us or doing it to us, but we were alone, like a loneliness of the soul in a way. And there was
no
nowhere
reception.
There was no reception. It's like we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. And as we know, one of the largest predictors of PTSD, especially in a military population, but really in any population, is prior trauma, right? And so it becomes kind of a cumulative thing because your nervous system then is wired to, I think of it as like an allergy, right? And not that the metaphor kind of breaks down because it's not that what you witnessed was innocuous, right? Like my allergy to pollen is probably like it is it's an innocuous stimuli, but then our bodies can continue to behave that way with innocuous stimuli. Shitty day at work, someone cuts you off in traffic, your partner looks at you sideways, whatever it is, and we can be completely activated. And I think what's really crucial for people to understand about trauma is that it's not like there's no, we can definitely say some things are worse than others. There's no question, right?
Yeah.
But in large part, the traumatic piece is what it activates in your body.
Yeah.
Right. So let's say you witness something and for whatever reason, I don't know, you're in a good space or whatever it is, your body is completely able to regulate it and digest it. And it's like, well, that happened and that sucked, but I think I'm okay. Like, and really mean it.
Yep.
Versus, leaving you in a state of semi-permanent quasi dysregulation at all times.
Yep.
And so a lot of people are like, yeah, but and again, it cycles back to the Gen X being emotionally neglected. Often we're like, why do I feel so shitty about what happened to me? Or like my traumas, and I'm putting this in finger quotes, or like, I had this really bad violin lesson once, right? Like it doesn't even compare, but and so people, I think, often feel a lot of shame and they downplay what they're experiencing because they're like, yeah, but it's not like such and such happened to me.
Right.
And
God, I've heard that so often.
Yeah, right. And so it's like, yes, but it's about what is activated in your body. And to go back to the generational thing, perhaps generationally something that happened, wired your nervous system to be hypersensitive. Who knows why you were experiencing this, but the point is that you are experiencing it and it is real and it is legitimate, and we have to talk about it, we have to hold it, we have to communicate it, like you say, we have to receive it in community, have those conversations, because downplaying it just gets us nowhere. Like it's not helpful to just pretend stuff is not happening. Now, it is useful to think about ways to regulate it and to kind of cope with it in more productive ways than freaking out. But at the same time, it's really critical that we bring that compassion and that allowing to whatever response is emerging within us.
Yeah. I find personally, like the internal dialogue is I think the best place to begin. I don't necessarily disregard the trauma itself, but I think what is more important than approaching full on kind of the exposure therapy type focus on the trauma is more of how to approach the perspective and how to kind of re-engage development of perspective itself, right? Of the ability to actually perceive something differently. And so oftentimes one of my kind of tools is walking through why they say what they say to themselves about themselves, kind of thing. And really developing that kind of communication, because you can talk to me all you want, but when you're talking about yourself, you reveal so much about things, right? Like you are an eloquent communicator, but I feel like if I were to have you talk about yourself, you'd reveal so much about yourself and how you feel about yourself in the words that you use, the consistency of language or the inconsistency of language, the habitual use of certain words, like all of those things kind of tone or set the tone of who you are and how you feel about yourself. Confident and comfortable people with themselves are remarkably consistent in how they define specific things, right? Like values. When they talk about empathy, like one of the things I've seen is that, like, when I talk about empathy, I have a consistent definition. Whereas like empaths, really interesting conversation, right? Some of the most empathetic people, and I'm not downplaying their abilities to be empathetic, but at the same time, remarkably able to be the complete opposite if they don't like that person, right? And so there's this, if they want to help someone, they're remarkably empathetic, but then they have no capacity to be empathetic towards someone that they dislike or that's wronged them. And then the question kind of becomes, is that actually following your value? Because I'm empathetic towards people that like me and dislike me. Not to say I don't hold boundaries to the people who are not empathetic or who are not people I like, but it's this consistency of understanding, how do I be an empathetic person to both sides? And that consistency, I see really, really big benefits to approaching that conversation rather than going straight to the trauma and saying, well, here's what happened and here's how wrong it was for you. To approach that perspective gives someone the ability to then look back into themselves and say, now I see that this trauma had an impact on how I actually talk to myself, to other people, how I communicate with myself and other people. It's developed negativity towards this, and it's kind of a redevelopment of how to perceive the world and everything that's in it and themselves specifically. But that's my experience, and it's been quite interesting. It's something that I've been developing an outline for a book for it for a while now, and I think more and more I need to just sit down and write that.
We can turn this into a coaching session about helping you develop an action plan for creating this. I mean, I think the empath piece is really an interesting one, because a lot of people, and I think you're right to flag the inconsistency there, because a lot of people will say, oh, I'm an empath. What they actually mean is, whether they realize it or not, is that I have a highly developed hypervigilant post-trauma response, because I learned that it's really, really important to pay very close attention to people's behaviors and cues, because if I don't, something bad's going to happen. So really, we're actually describing, a lot of people who say they're empaths are actually simply post-traumatically hypervigilant, which explains a lot of the inconsistency and dysregulation. It's interesting you talk about exposure too, because like in many domains of trauma treatment, there's been a move away from exposure therapy and re-traumatization. And if you think about it, like there's not necessarily a ton of value in continuing to activate you, right? If we use the allergy analogy, like to continually toss pollen in your face, like, how are you feeling? Try to not sneeze, right?
Are you not allergic anymore?
That's right. We're going to work on your sneezing regulation, right? Whereas there's been a move away to using more kind of like what are described as broaden and build strategies, right? Which are establishing connection, establishing safety, a healthy safety, not kind of like a withdrawal sort of protective safety, but more like a true psychological safety kind of thing. So we really focus on kind of amplifying resources rather than insisting that someone continue to revisit something shitty that occurred to them, right? Because for a lot of people, there's not a lot of value. Like, how many times do you need to revisit some horrifying scene that you witnessed? Without giving you resources and capacity to regulate and to kind of dial down the intensity of that. And that's one of the things I think is fascinating about the potential of psychedelics, because, what they do is they open a window by activating particular brain circuitry. They open a window of both neuroplasticity and kind of the dampening down of the threat response. So when they co-occur at the same time, it seems to be like, it's not like, the things you come up with when you smoked weed or when you're drunk. Like, you come up with great ideas when you're drunk, and then you write them down, and the next morning you're like, what even was that? Like, that was just
Right.
ridiculous, right? But with these class of drugs, what seems to happen is the insights persist. So you have this window of neuroplasticity, it opens, you get activation of particular serotonin receptors, and then whatever insights, whatever perspective, whatever broadening you have persists. And, I've talked to people going through the process of working through the trauma with psychedelics, and they say, yeah, it's like during the therapy, I tried to pull up the trauma. I tried to pull up the anxiety and the fear and the worry. And it's like my brain just didn't care, or it wasn't important, or it just somehow couldn't activate. And I think that feeling persisted. And now, after having the psychedelic experience, I'm like, oh, it's just, I somehow can't get the edge on that memory that I used to have. And so it's kind of settled it down.
It's really interesting to me. I don't know if you've ever read the book Trauma and Memory by Peter Levine.
Classic. I mean, Peter Levine's one of the
Right,
OGs in the
right.
field. Yeah.
It in that book, he talks about how memory is processed and held within the body. I know you know this, but to kind of give an understanding for people who are listening, and one of the things he talks about is how memory is accessed and rebuilt each time, because it's a protein in many ways. And so memory is not held in a file cabinet in the head. It's held within the entire body in different places, and that's been proven by many different studies. So what's curious to me is, if that's the case, I wonder if psychedelics actually approach the memory, the proteins, or the memories within the protein structure, and redevelop that structure, or redefine how that structure is actually engaged. That makes me really curious about that. And I'd love to see any kind of studies that kind of come out with that in mind, of how does psychedelics actually approach memory? Because obviously trauma is intrinsically within the memory system, not obviously every part of it, but there has to be something to that. And it's an interesting kind of direction to think about for me.
Definitely. And I mean, there's now such an explosion of research. And I think we'll discover that different substances are better for different things, right? There
Yeah.
are clinical trials on psilocybin, on ketamine, on MDMA, even stuff like DMT, LSD. Like, there's been a real resurgence of interest. It's funny because, we're talking about World War II. Like, they were actually doing a lot of this research in the 30s,
Yeah.
and the 60s too. But like in the 30s, there was actually some real interest in the potential of certain kinds of drugs, and then the war just kind of shut down a lot of very socially progressive things. So I definitely think, and we were talking about as well about like what's going to happen in the next 10 years. I think that there will increasingly be a more open attitude about what potential these kinds of experiences can offer. And not just, it's not just about what the drug does pharmacologically in terms of, because we know, like you said, trauma disorganizes our sense of time, space, memory, safety, all of these kind of core processes in our brain. But it's not just that the chemical does this particular thing. It's also about, a lot of practitioners talk about set and setting, right? And so here we come back to, setting a therapeutic agenda, having an experience in an atmosphere of safety and security and support and closeness and connection and control, like having a feeling of like, I'm going to be okay. Like, I control this environment. I'm going to be okay. And
Right.
then debriefing afterwards, like that's a completely different experience than, like I said, how we did it in university, which is just totally like random,
Right.
disorganized, and
Yeah.
3 a.m. making poor life choices. So I think we'll start to develop protocols and much more thoughtful ways of addressing these kinds of things that people have. So I mean, I feel optimistic.
Yeah.
So I know that people have been traumatized forever because traumatic things have always happened to human beings, but I feel more optimistic than ever about the potential for mental health. So,
Yep.
we were talking before about, it seems like things are getting worse, but that's because people are talking about things now.
Right.
And as we talk about them, and there's increasing interest in how do we work through these things, and there's discoveries of like, oh my gosh, you too? Oh yeah, like this happened to me. And like suicide, I think, is one of those topics, for example, that
Facts.
is so hush hush. Heaven forbid you go to a therapist and discuss any suicidal ideation. Like, you just imagine they're pressing the red button on the desk, right?
Yep.
To have the nice men in white coats come and take you away. And so what this unfortunately does is it cuts off a really critical set of conversations that you could be having with
Yes.
someone who could help you, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I personally believe that suicidal ideation, if not attempts, are astonishingly common in the
Yes.
population along the continuum, however you want to define it. And so I think if we were to discover truly how many people had experienced some type of thoughts and feelings that we could put on that continuum, I think we would find it was the vast majority of people for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And again, having, I think I have a really unique perspective on suicide because I've both seen the adverse effects of what happens when someone else does it. Obviously my dad. But then that developed into its own suicidal ideation itself. Not because he made the choice, which is interesting, right? It was in the aftermath of my own suicide. I made 4 rules, which should be quite interesting in all of this discussion. The first was I won't do tobacco, I won't do drugs because he had done both, and then alcohol. I wouldn't do that because he was an alcoholic. But then the fourth one is I won't commit suicide. One of my rules was I won't commit suicide. That was those were my founding principles. I didn't care what the fuck else I did. Those were my rules that I would not disobey. And yet I found myself so many years later, right, continually thinking about suicide every single day, whether it was it started off with his suicide, but the interactions I had, right, especially with pain. Following my dad's suicide, I was abused by the next man in my life, my mom's boyfriend, who came a couple years later, as punishment. Right, he was the disciplinarian. So anytime I did something wrong, I was hit with a 3/4 inch leather Western type style belt. Certain amount of times. Right, he made the determination of how egregious the action was. And so I learned very quickly that pain was not important. Right. And so I would kind of look up at him, and I remember kind of thinking, you know what, I'm not going to give you the fucking satisfaction of seeing my tears and my emotions. So I started creating silence around that and isolation within that. And I would only cry when I was alone. And that interaction kind of developed itself into this monster of an internal dialogue that was focused and centralized around suicidal ideation. And that conceptualization eventually led me to a point in my life where, after a deployment where I saw a whole lot of things, and went through a whole lot of stress, and then following a recent breakup, I got to a point where I just didn't care about my rules anymore. I had upheld the first 3. I've never actually, to this day, it's August of 2022. I've never drank alcohol. I've never smoked, or done any tobacco. I shouldn't say just smoke. I've never even vaped. Right. I've never even had rum cake. Right. Like when I was a young boy,
I'm
like
impressed. You're hardcore.
someone offered me rum cake, and I was like, no, I don't drink. Right. Like, because I didn't understand it. Right.
That's wise, though. Those little old ladies, man, they put way more rum in that cake than you would imagine.
But I've never had it. And I've never done any drugs outside of prescription drugs for knee surgeries. I've had a few knee surgeries, but even then, I only took pain pills for like 2 days after my knee surgeries. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to man up. And I was like, I didn't like it, but I did it. And so, like, I would follow those rules religiously. So they were really important rules to me. But I got to a point where I was in so much internal conflict. I had so much internal conflict that the rule had to be broken because I couldn't see any other way. Because I had isolated for so long, I'd never talked about suicide. The only way that I talked about anything involving my dad was when people asked me if I drank. It's like, hey, you want to drink? I'd be like, nope, my dad committed suicide because he was an alcoholic. And then they would feel sorry for me or whatever they felt and wouldn't talk about it. Be like, oh, I'm sorry to ask. And so I like, cool. That was kind of a way to push people away. Perfect. Right. And so I used that. I weaponized it in some ways. And it brought me to a point where I was isolated. I crafted that idea. And so it wasn't his choice. Like if you say, it's just because someone commits suicide means that another person is going to commit suicide. No, it's the internal dialogue that develops the idea of making that choice. And that's important, right? A community like veterans, right? When we craft the idea that because one veteran commits suicide, more veterans are going to commit suicide, it's not really lending to the full conversation. We have a whole community of people that were taught to suffer in silence. That teaches people to kill themselves because they can't talk about it. They can't express themselves. They can't have conversations about these things. But when you do, when I go to a room full of soldiers and I have a conversation about suicide and I talk to them, always someone comes up to me and says, thank you. Why? Why would they do that? Because no one in their history of being in the organization of the military or being as a veteran ever had the audacity to come up and have a conversation about a topic so intrinsically taboo or difficult to that point within them. And for the first time, they have the ability to actually understand the perspective of someone else. So we need to have more conversations and have different conversations, because I'm not the only unique story here. There are more people that have unique stories that have different ways of reaching people. That's why I think social media is so important. It's dangerous. I'll agree to that, but it's so important because you and me and 100 other people have the same experience with different circumstances. We all have, there's 102 different ways to explain our circumstances and express our circumstances that will impact millions of people. And that's an ability that mankind in every generation before ours has never had.
Mm-hmm. There's actually a really interesting book, and I've forgotten the title. I'll look it up afterwards and send it to you. You can put it in your show notes.
Sure.
But it looks at the history of warfare. And one of the points it brings up, especially in the context of masculinity, because for so long, warfare has been defined as the province of masculinity. We know that it's not historically, but let's say for a moment. And it talks about how in warrior societies where, warfare, combat formed kind of a predominant part of that culture and cultural practices, preparing for war and coming home from war had very specific rituals of community associated with them, so that they created these kind of like interstitial liminal spaces, the in-between spaces. Mm-hmm. So you weren't just like home and then war. There was this kind of in-between space of coming up or coming down from that experience, during which you were in community with people who were either going to face the same thing as you or had experienced the same thing as you. And so what this did, it kind of provided like this transition zone of debriefing, of processing, of digestion, where, you could process this stuff with people who really got it, who'd been through the same thing. And it talks about how one of the challenges now is that literally you could be in Afghanistan on Tuesday and home on Thursday, walking through a Bed Bath and Beyond, just going like, what the fuck? Like just being such a bizarre,
that's
jarring
so
transition, right? And you're listening to a music and someone's arguing about the color of the towels, and you 3 days ago watched something horrific and you're just like, I don't even know how to process this right now. And so at this point, for warfighters and anyone involved in these kinds of professions, whether that's frontline workers or first responders, whoever, we do not digest. We don't have these in-between spaces of psychic digestion where people can process this stuff in a community of people who get it, who understand, and who've been through the same thing. So, if we could kind of like think about solutions, I definitely think that's one really key piece, because as you say, it's so hard to express this
Yeah.
if you haven't gone through it. And those of us who have not gone through it, we can do our best, but like we are never going to get anywhere close to people who have actually experienced similar thing. And that holds true for any domain of trauma, right? And this is why it's so important for people from all communities and all walks of life to become engaged in the mental health conversation, because if I'm someone from a marginalized group, I don't necessarily want to go see a white middle-class therapist in their cardigan sweater sitting in their office, like just not understanding my life experiences, right?
Yeah.
So it's super, super important that, all of us collectively engage in mental and emotional health work in whatever capacity we can, because we need to find nodes of connection. And so, yeah, so it's great. So women come to talk to you and like you find that node of connection. For some reason, I work really well with young guys. I don't know why,
Yeah.
but whatever reason, the magic is there. But we need to have a really good buffet menu of people that we can go and connect with who are in the mental health field and who can help us and connect with us, because otherwise we're kind of out alone here in the wilderness, coming home from battle, just completely disconnected and destabilized.
The Pier 1 comment, just like
that place is a trip at the best of times.
so relatable. It wasn't a Pier 1, but it was similar. It
Yeah.
was God, what was that called? It was a store similar to that. And I remember walking out of it just like I was with my mom because I had just gotten home. I think it was like I think maybe a week. I remember getting in the car and we started driving and we stopped at a stoplight for a second. I remember her looking over at me and asking me the question like, "Are you okay?" And because I was thinking about stuff. Um and I just like told her, I'm like, I saw a triple amputee. And like that's that moment. She had no idea what to do. I didn't even know what to do. I didn't even know how to talk about it then. Um, it's such a powerful memory, and it's such a powerful thing to just say. Even now, obviously, but you you have no idea what to do with that sometimes, right? And I didn't see all that much. That was probably one of the most profound things I saw. But to kind of sit with that and to realize that there's other people that sit with far worse, if you've ever read a book called On Killing, like the ability to actually kill human beings does not come natural to people. It's actually a remarkably difficult thing unless you're sociopathic or psychopathic. You really have an adverse reaction to it unless you've trained for it and developed a justification for it in some ways. And so like having that conversation with my mom for the first time only a couple days after, I was like, I just remember that. Like that's what I was thinking about walking through the store looking at fucking furniture. And I was just like, the fuck am I doing here? Right. Like I still remember like kind of thinking of like what would it be like to not have, because what I saw was a triple amputee that had no legs, and his arm was basically hanging by a ligament or something, or a tendon, to have one arm, like to even if he survived that, right? But he didn't, unfortunately. But like to think about, that's the kind of thing you're thinking about when you're looking at furniture with your mother. How do you explain that? And how do you express that? It's such a remarkably difficult experience, and there's no, like you talk about reintegration with the military. This is one of the biggest problems that I have with the reintegration process, is that there is no reintegration process. It's here's all this paperwork that you have to do. Here's, you got to go have your medical checkup, but it's not a fucking medical checkup. It's a survey that nobody's going to be honest about. They don't even give you the common courtesy of having a person like disarm the idea of, where you have like disarm the idea of we're going to do something to you if you tell us the wrong thing. There's none of that. It's this stigmatized event that if you say anything, you're going to stay there longer and you're not going to see your family and you're not going to go home. And I'm not surprised at all, but it's one of my biggest issues is that we have these reintegration events that don't really provide anything constructive when it comes to PTSD and trauma and things that you see at war. And it's a remarkably, I don't want to say worthless, because I'm sure some people get some kind of value out of it, but I never did. I never have. Like both deployments I've been on and came home from, I garnished no benefits from the reintegration time, because it was never structured for the purposes of the human being. It was always structured for the purposes of the organization. And that's a big problem for me, because we're dealing with people here. We're not dealing with a system. We're not dealing with an organization. We're dealing with people who you just asked as a nation to go serve in a place that is remarkably desolate, destructive, disturbing. And now you bring them home and let them loose without any regard for their experiences. And I think it's a big failure. And you can't, I hate to say, because it's there and it's an organization that's designed to help, but the VA doesn't help in many ways. Certainly there are people that benefit from it, but by and far, I think the experiences that I've seen and the research that I've done, the VA really isn't the harbinger of support and connection that veterans need. And so it certainly lends itself to a bigger conversation about how do we actually support veterans? How do we kind of relinquish the idea that we might have it wrong, that we might be doing it wrong. And now that we're at peace, all of the things that, we've learned the last 20 years are going to get thrown out the window, because someone's going to have a good idea the next time we have a war, and we're going to do that. And we can only hope that it's someone that has the experiences of like myself or you, that you realize that you have to focus on the individual and not the organization, to make sure that people are good and people are okay. And it's difficult. It's a very difficult circumstance. And I've done it twice now. The first one was horrible. The second one was easy because I had done the work to understand who I was. It was a very different deployment, but it was much easier.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's worth saying what the first step can be for people listening to this, because, if you're just listening to this, you're not seeing what I'm doing or feeling. And I mean, I don't know how your mom reacted in that moment, but I think there's something to be said for simply compassionate witnessing.
Yeah.
Not trying to fix anything that happened, not trying to rush off the topic, allowing the space for you to say, this is what happened, this is what I saw, to provide that, acknowledgement of like, yeah, that's real. And I'm here with you in this moment, witnessing this experience that you're having without rushing off it, without, oh, let's look on the upside. You're at least I heard someone recently say that some of the two worst words in the face of grief and trauma are at least. Well, at least, you came home and blah, blah, blah. Like, fuck, like what a way to invalidate someone,
Yeah.
right? So I think building the skill at the most basic level of compassionate witnessing is so profound. And I mean, it takes us to kind of challenging places, but I think, like you alluded to earlier, these are also challenging places within yourself, because when I witness your suffering and hold it compassionately, I also have to touch the place of suffering within myself, right? Which is unique to me. And so, I mean, if nothing else, my wish for our culture, which I think we're kind of talking around North America culturally too, but I think one of the contradictions you're implicitly pointing out is that we have, especially a country like the US, where a situation where there is a military machine that takes the bodies of young people and sends them out to do things. And trauma gets written on those bodies. And then those bodies are kind of not cared for when
Yeah.
they come back. And I think this is really almost like a human rights kind of challenge, because then these people, if they make it home, have to live with this. And I think, you know, you bring up Dave Grossman's book on killing, which I think is one of the most profound kind of works of philosophical and practical insight
Yeah.
created. And there's a psychotherapist called Resmaa Menakem, whose work I really love, and he talks about things like colonization and slavery, and how this was deeply painful, obviously, for the people that were on the receiving end, but also painful for the people that were doling it out, because,
Yeah.
like you say, most of us who are not sociopaths and psychopaths
Right.
know that on some level, inflicting violence on others harms them and harms us.
Yeah.
Right. So
Or,
all of us are kind of like embedded in this web of
right.
suffering in a way.
Have you heard of the book Ordinary Men?
No.
Oh man, Ordinary Men. I know I have it. I have it right here. So I'll put this in the show notes. Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland. So this book is an example of people that were not Nazis conducting the final solution, right? The ending of Jewish lives for the Third Reich. And I mean, it is just a staggering account of this unit that was that conducted atrocities. People that obviously didn't necessarily agree with what was being done, but was obviously forced to do it anyway. So it's a very I think it's just a very important thing to read. I think it's a very important book to understand, because it very much talks about the same thing that I would imagine Reza Menakem talks about. Although I haven't read his work, I'm going to. But it's just remarkable that you'd be so surprised at the violence that people can commit, and the atrocities that people can commit. You look at like things like the Vietnam War, and the response that U.S. soldiers would conduct on, you know, the massacres, the My Lai massacre, the amount of times, you know, U.S. soldiers killed people for their benefit, you know, or not necessarily for their benefit, but because of their emotional response to losing a friend or losing a soldier before that. There's so many stories that have come out talking about that kind of war, and war is war. You know, there's nothing good about it, right? It is what it is, and there's no good way to conduct a war, right? Unless you want to go back to Revolutionary War and Civil War, I don't think that's good either, right? Even if people are just standing 75 meters across from each other and shooting at each other, there's nothing comfortable about that. And so war in itself is just going to become more and more destructive, more and more difficult for people. But at the basic level, we can understand human violence. And I've always kind of had I was a sociology. I got my bachelor's in sociology, and I was a sociology grad student. And one of the biggest things I had with the academic situation, I would say, I don't even know how to explain it, was I always looked at violence as one of kind of the foundational structures to really pay attention to when we're talking about humans. And that was not welcomed in sociology. You know, all of
I'm laughing because coming from feminist and social justice communities, it's exactly the same. And I think you
yeah.
and I are probably more aligned on this than we've
and
both
I,
been excommunicated from our
right.
academic communities.
And it wasn't I chose to be I chose to excommunicate myself. I probably could have stayed and I would have pushed this subject. But there's such a lack of research on violence.
Mm-hmm.
Not like, the funny thing is like sociology really focuses on like murder rates as like
Mm-hmm.
and violent crimes, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't understand the conceptualization of things uh like domestic violence, and what does that really represent? What is
Mm-hmm.
like how trauma is received and how it's conducted, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when people hurt people, that's the stuff that I want to approach as violence.
Mm-hmm.
um and that was never welcomed in my time as a sociology grad student. And it really, when I came home from deployment, I was like, I'm not going back to that. I don't enjoy that. I didn't enjoy any of it. I tried to have conversations and couldn't get through to people. I was never received. um, and so here I am, obviously doing this and kind of um, exposing it in my own way and studying it in my own way. And I think that's obviously good for me, but I have to be careful, right? Because I think academic wise, you have this structure around you that's in some way good, right? Where people kind of limit your scope. And that's good until that scope becomes so limited where you can't step outside the box and say, hey, what about this?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I always try to, whenever I conduct research and I try and understand something, I try to take that stance, or bring people in to have these conversations where maybe I'm wrong, right? Or and try and focus that scope of how I think academics should be. But yeah, I think violence is such a profound thing to discuss, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised that I'm honestly really surprised that you've read On Killing, because it just doesn't seem like one of those works that you would read as a gender studies or a women's studies in academics in any capacity. But I love it. I'm pleasantly surprised, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, like one of the things that kind of excommunicated me from many kind of progressive communities was I used to joke that my hobby was consensual violence, and not
Yeah.
in a sex way, but and certainly not, in any way reproducing actual violence. But I was into combat sports,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's a place where, I mean, I think you said something earlier, which I think is worth really bringing up, is that, and the ordinary people concept, I think is part of it, but there is a darkness within almost all of us
Yes.
that if we
Yes.
fail to acknowledge doesn't go away. And I think there's a real discomfort on the part of socially progressive people to talk about this, because if if I acknowledge the darkness, the ferocity,
Mm-hmm.
the straight up fucked upness
Yes.
within myself, um, that it becomes very hard to construct a worldview that seems compatible with things like human rights and and like kind of the general like world peace. Like I think we can all agree that world peace is probably a great idea. Like let's not just waste time, trying to annihilate each other. I think everyone's probably on board with that, but it's also really critical to develop a worldview that is nuanced,
Yeah.
that reflects what we do know to be true about human beings, and especially like never mind just talking about violence in general, but let's talk about violence and aggression within marginalized communities. I mean, talking about women and aggression, holy crap, like that
Yeah.
was just unmentionable. So, I mean, I used to joke, like, I mean, I've never been an athletic person really per se, but like I played soccer when I was a kid. And I was always like, if you tell me that girls are all sugar and spice, I have been kicked in the face by many sugar and spice little girls out there. So like, don't tell me that women are like naturally pacifistic or, anything like that. But I mean, I do have a real fascination for, and not a morbid fascination, not a like a kind of being a spectator kind of fascination, but I'm deeply interested in how do we understand all of the facets of being human. And there was some very profound research that came out of the wars that was like, you can take an average person, not a sociopath, not a bad person, but the average schmo who used to work in an office 10 years ago and is now happily electrocuting people. Like we can create that person.
Yeah.
We know this to be true. And I kind of joke Yes, kind of a not really. Like there was a period in psychology before the ethics board got in on it where like you
Right.
probably shouldn't be doing this, right? But like we learned some of the most profound truths about humanity during that couple of decades when scientists were just running rampant, doing all kinds of crazy experiments on people. We learned a lot about what human beings are capable of, and I think if we do not acknowledge the full extent of what human beings can do, then we're never really able to solve those human problems
Yeah.
because I was just listening to a podcast on addiction, and they were talking about some of the limitations of things like abstinence only models. Like it simply doesn't acknowledge the
Yeah.
full spectrum of human experience. And if we don't do that, then we can't grapple with this. So if we cannot grapple, if we can't talk about suicide, if we can't talk about violent impulses and behavior, if we can't talk about all manner of human dysfunction or function, because I mean, here's the other piece, right? Aggression has an adaptive function. And I firmly believe that the reason that many marginalized people, especially women who are socialized out of aggression, are grappling with mental health issues is because there's no place for that stuff to live. A friend of mine, a boxing coach in Toronto, actually runs this group. She calls it the Church of Rage. And basically, it's like once a month on Sunday, people get together and smash shit and like
Yeah.
get the rage out. And a lot of them are people who have some kind of marginalized identity and need a place for that stuff to live. So currently, we don't know how to hold grief. We don't know how to hold anger. We don't know how to hold aggression. We don't know how to hold violent impulses and dark impulses in productive ways that help us metabolize this and help us digest it properly. Because that stuff's there.
Right.
Whether you want it to be or not, that stuff is there. So, you know, we might as well open it up.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny that you say that, because my book is literally called Defy the Darkness, right? Like there's a function that when you said aggression has an adaptive function, it just makes so much sense to me. But the idea, I think I learned this long ago, is that the darker parts of my being are never going to go away. And the recognition of that is, it requires constant and consistent maintenance to keep myself balanced. And that's a good thing, right? Because I don't want to lose the darker parts of me. And I'll tell you why. And it's not just like my job in the National Guard right now is I'm a sniper section leader. So obviously part of my job is literally focused and centralized around the effective killing of human beings, right? It's my job, right? And teaching other people how to do it. If we took that away and just life, right? If someone broke into my house and was threatening the life of my family, that darkness is really important right there. Because if you don't have the ability to step into that scenario and fight for your life, then not only you are going to lose, but your family then loses, right? And so this effectiveness of utilizing dark parts of yourself, if you want to call it that. I don't even necessarily like the idea of looking at it as light and dark. What is necessary, right? I think fighting is necessary, right? It's not something I'm going to walk to my neighbor's house and fight him. That's not necessary. But if someone encroaches upon my space and enters into a dangerous altercation with me without my say so, without my agreed upon, like if we're having a boxing match, cool. But if you come into my house threatening the life of my family and myself, I'm going to fight you. Right. And I think that's okay. I think that's acceptable. And I'm going to win that fight, or I'm going to die trying. Right. Like that darkness is so fundamentally effective in the use of force at that point. Because if you've never put yourself in any kind of situation where you fought, where you've had to fight, whether it's training or real, you got to dig for something. You need something, right? You've got to find something that emphasizes that this is more important to me than it is for you, and I'm going to beat you. right? Whether that's technique or whether that's sheer will. There are certain movies that I think you can kind of recall that show a lot of that. Things like there's a scene in Saving Private Ryan, and I think was by and far one of the most uh, dramatic and engaging scenes that you'll ever see in a movie. And it's when the German basically stabs the Jewish man or the Jewish U.S. soldier in the chest with his own knife. That scene plays out, and it's one of the most remarkable examples of fight or die, right? And and you even see him begging for his life in some capacity, and then you hear the knife enter his chest cavity, and you're like, I mean, the first time you ever see that kind of thing, it's like, holy shit, right? Like that's a is that exactly how it plays out? I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, you can read stories about people who have killed people in combat and see that. Um, but it's necessary because there's people out there who will actively and willingly do that to you without question, right? There are psychopaths and sociopaths out there, but there are also people who are just trying to get by, who are, things like pedophiles, right? There are people who are murderers, who are serial murderers. There are people who are rapists, who are willing to who are willing to do these atrocious and egregious actions. And if you think they're not going to find someone, if they're not going to find you, then you're already making yourself a target that's easy to find, right? You're already giving them a plus one in their book to, they're looking for people who don't pay attention, right? If you make yourself a hard target, we were just talking about this in my last podcast with a man who runs Saving Innocence in LA, Alan Smith. He runs an organization that talks about sex trafficking. If you make yourself an easy target, you're going to be an easy target. If you make yourself someone that is by sheer will and defiance willing to use darkness against other people who are willing to use theirs, you're a hard target. And people recognize that. There's a difference. You can see a difference, right? When you see a normal man who's never been to combat, who's never been traumatized, walking down the street, compared to me, you will see a difference because I am looking at every single person that's coming by me, right? I know what your hands are doing. I know what your eyes are doing. I know why the fuck are you wearing a coat in July, right? Like, I pay attention to that stuff. Why? Because, well, I've been shot at a couple times before, right? I've been blown up. I've had friends blown up. I've lost people to these things. And so I pay attention, right? I pay attention to abnormal behavior or highly observant behavior. And what's funny is I can tell who is being attentive in terms of kind of vigilance, of watching out for themselves, and who is not, right? In terms of who is actually being observant to attack and provoke and the bad things, right? You can see the difference, right? You watch veterans, how do they place themselves? Well, they usually place themselves next to a wall or in a place where they can see the exits, where they can see the most amount of territory when they feel safe behind them, right? Aggressors find the places where they'll find the most unsuspecting victims, right? It's not about safety. It's about finding the victim. And so you'll see the difference in people. And if you never pay attention to any of that, well, you might become a victim. And that's why this conversation is so important and so profound. I love that you have done this research and looked into this, because aggression certainly does have an adaptive function. And it's something that is scary, because if you look at, pedophilia and sex trafficking, certainly it's become adaptive, right? It's online now when it didn't used to be. It's far more intricate and uncontrollable than it was before, and it's only going to get worse. And unless people pay attention and start approaching conversations about it and making it aware, making people aware of it. And so I just love that you're I just love that. It's rare to have conversations about stuff like this, and it's kind of intriguing.
Well, I mean, and it has to be a kind of a layered conversation because, for example, like if we talk about sexualized violence, right? And, one of the great gifts that, feminists and other social progressive have brought to the conversation is to speak out against what we might call rape culture or, victim blaming and, that kind of stuff, which I think is 100% legitimate.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's also very difficult to have conversations about situational awareness or, reducing your statistical probability of, being a recipient of aggression. And there are behaviors that we can engage in and attitudes that we can have and perspectives that we can take that do reduce our statistical probability of being involved in these things. And I think quite unfortunately, women are socialized to ignore the cues that evolution has given us. Like we have millions of years of evolution. Like we know when something is wrong. We see a sketchy person, or at least those of us who are perceptive, you see a sketchy guy 100 meters down, you're like, not going in this direction, right?
Yeah.
But women, I think, are so socialized to be nice, to not make a fuss. Well, like there's all these messages that we receive. And so I actually think that aggression and anger, are a real gift for anyone who could potentially, I mean, all of us can be vulnerable. All of us are only temporarily able-bodied, independent, safe and all that kind of stuff, right? So any of us can be the recipient of violence. We know that some people are more likely than others. But, I do think that as part of the conversation, we also need to be talking about building skills, behaviors, trusting those evolutionary gifts that we have of detecting danger, of detecting unsafety, and full steam ahead, responding in the correct way to that, rather than being like, well, I didn't want to be, impolite, or I didn't want to be rude and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, fuck no, if I see a sketchy dude, I'm going the other way. I'm a 5-foot tall woman. Like, like, and I mean, this is the other piece too. Like, I think it's really critical. Like, okay, great. I love combat sports. That's awesome. I'm also 5 feet tall, 49 years old, female, 115 pounds. Like physics is a thing. My partner is literally twice my size. Right. How does he subdue me? He can just sit on me. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like there's no skill required. His sheer body weight is enough to just steamroll me, right? And so I think that we want to be really clear about what advantages do you have? Well, maybe it's not size, maybe it's your mind, maybe it's your intuition, maybe it's perceptiveness, what skills, whatever it is, right? What disadvantages do you have? And both of those things, I think you have to get real about and conduct a very as objective and accurate as possible appraisal of what you're working with in any given situation. And I think, that does not disavow the fact that anyone who attacks me is a dick for doing it. Right? Like it doesn't make it okay. Right. It doesn't mean I invited it, but I like to think about the game of probabilities, and I like increasing my probability of survival. But there's another piece that I think, we circled around a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think it's worth mentioning, which is when I talk about darkness, I'm not talking about aggression. I'm talking the part of you that enjoys aggression, right? There were moments, so I'm a great training partner, like when we're training, we're having fun, it's all a game, it's a good time, until there's that moment where like you're progressively pushing the limits of dickishness.
If you punch me in the ear, that's mine.
Right. Like you're doing a lot of dick moves, you're doing a little fish hooky thing, like you're trying to see what you can get away with. And there's a moment where I'm like, we're just not going to do this anymore. And I'm now going to enjoy inflicting harm on you, right? And like you brought this on yourself. So like I can think of many moments where I purposely inflicted physical and psychological harm on people, once we cross that threshold. And I fully acknowledge that impulse in myself. I don't disavow it in any way. I just think it's really interesting to identify the fact that all of us, I believe, have the potential to enjoy inflicting pain. So to me, the definition of evil is how much you enjoy inflicting pain on others, unless someone's paying you for it, unless you're like a professional or a hurt giver to someone. But like, I think unless we can talk about that, it's going to remain a part of ourselves that is hidden, but like water finds its way to the surface. And so maybe it comes out as lateral violence in some kind of way or another. I think it's always going to come out.
I think it lends itself to a kind of a macro conversation about nature in my mind. Like there's this fundamental idea to me that we are a piece of nature, and we've built societies to kind of isolate ourselves and create safety surrounding ourselves that says it's humanity versus nature, when the reality is the opposite. It's humanity is still a part of nature. And even if I were to stop living in my house in 50 years, my house would be overgrown by nature, right? And so there's this, I think, this false pretext or pretense that uh, that society is safe from nature, but we are nature. Humans are nature, and humans are one of the most effective killing machines on the planet, if not the cosmos potentially. Who knows? But we are remarkably good at killing things, to the fact that we've made it industrial, right? Like just imagine how many chickens we kill every year. It's almost unimaginable. And so to think for any moment that making a society relinquishes the idea that violence won't happen is ridiculous to me. And when we have these conversations about, rape culture, it's absolutely fair to have that conversation about how interaction and things implicitly create, uh, you know, bad things like rape or situations of rape. But it is ridiculous to completely think that we are going to be safe in our societies and our comfortable homes and stuff like that. It's ridiculous. We can't stop that. That's why we have police. That's why we have militaries. That's why we have people. That's why we have self-defense intrinsically developed within law and legal standings, because we know people are fucked up. And we should always remember that, right? People are always going to be fucked up, right? There's going to be people on the outskirts of society that, we're going to try and bring as many people into the fold as we can. But there's going to be people that are going to be so resentful and so contemptuous that they can't be brought in. And those are evil people that enjoy exactly what you said, enjoy conducting violence, and enjoy things like sexual assault, sexual violence, rape, murder, right? Torture. There's going to be people like that. And we have to be remarkably careful, no matter who you are, right? But more so people that are more likely to be victimized, right? And that's an unfortunate reality within human structures. And I love that we're able to balance that in this conversation, because again, in my experience in academics, it just wasn't something that we could have a conversation on. And I was like, bro, I just went to Afghanistan. Like, this needs to be a conversation. Like, you're completely negating a factor of society that totally undermines your premises here of like, we can have a structurally safe society. Like, no, we fucking can't. Right. There's people that don't agree with you. And there are people that want to hang you from the rafters or put you in Connex boxes in the middle of Afghanistan and let you literally bake to death. Like, these are not normal. If you think these aren't normal circumstances, like, you just haven't been in a place where you deprive people of certain things.
And I mean, I think you're hitting on something so important, which circles us back around at the beginning of this conversation. So like, it's kind of nice as we wind this conversation down, we return to the beginning, because it's like, law and order and safety. Like, I think this is a prime concern of a lot of people. And for a lot of people, I think, the immediate solution is like, oh, we need more kind of, I don't know, militaristic solutions to this. And I mean, there's lots of solutions to a complex social problem. There's never going to be just like one fix to it. But if I could advocate for one important intervention, it would be to assist people in healing trauma. Because experiencing trauma generationally, individually, whatever, so significantly increases, it's that hurt people thing, right? And so my likelihood of doing darkness violence so incredibly increases when I have had my own stuff kind of not cared for, right? So like, the more we, like, caring for mental health is not a luxury. it is a necessity. So
Right.
if we want a safer society, building better walls is not really necessarily the solution that's going to get. I mean, all it does is freak people out even more. We need to address generational, collective, cultural, individual trauma in order to increase our probability of safety. So we're never going to, like, again, never going to be a completely safe space, so to speak, but we can make it safer using what we know about how humans operate. So it's kind of nice that we're sort of like
Yeah.
tying all the pieces together here.
I completely agree. You know, and not even to lend itself to a political conversation, but that I think is so overlooked in the realm of politics that you know, there's like this, the political mental health is a buzzword, but it's not a conversation about what it really should be, of like just how traumatized society is. Like we live in a almost an entire, you know, earth is just entirely traumatized.
Well, on a global scale, I mean, I would say the last few years for everybody have been just deeply debilitating, deeply destabilizing, and again, to bring up something from the beginning of our conversation, generationally, right? Like we think about Gen Z, it's like, oh my God, what are you poor bastards inheriting, right? Like they just got out of the womb and they're like, whoa,
Right.
like what flaming pile of garbage have you left us with, right? But I certainly, it's actually, it's rare, I would say, to kind of share the phenomena that we have experienced over the last few years so collectively.
Yeah.
But anyway, well, I'm sure we could spiral off
Yeah.
into lots more.
That's what's going to make the next 10 years so interesting, isn't it? Well, you're right. I think we could, you know, talk about all sorts of things for the next couple days, I imagine, but we gotta call it a day. But I'll ask you the final question so you can kind of give your words of wisdom. So Krista, if there was one message you could leave the world, what would that be?
Yeah. I'm going to kind of cheat because it's not really my message, but it's something that one of my former coworkers used to say, which is that nothing worth doing can be done alone. And I love that concept that, you know, we can do lots of things as independent individuals, absolutely. But if we want to do great things and heal and really make significant growth or movement forward, we need to do it in community, in partnership, in connection. And so nothing worth doing can be done alone. You know, we need to continue to find ways to be in relation. And that's so hard because relationships are icky and complicated and fraught and demanding. And they, you know, like our spouses and significant others and kids and close friends. Like, I mean, there are lots of layers and it's complicated. It's not easy, but we need other people in order to fully flourish. So my best hope is that we continue to find ways to live in authentic community with each other.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's a fantastic piece of wisdom. You know, it's something that's certainly I think I had to learn the hard way. You know, with my suicide attempt, it was probably the first time I actually thought, you know what, maybe I should bring someone into this and have a conversation. And there's certainly nothing since then has been alone, and I welcome that. I hope someone listens to that and recognizes how important it is. And I hope people took something from this conversation, because this was fantastic. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I'm glad. It reminds me of one of my old counseling instructors used to say, even if you're lost in the woods, it's better to be together. Yeah. And I always love that.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Krista, thank you. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for giving us your wisdom, your thoughts, your ideas. I'll have all sorts of links to find Krista in the show notes below. So if you're still listening to this, if you're still watching this, thank you. And we'll catch you next time on the Dylan Experience.
Thank you.
And that is it.